Hello, everyone, and welcome to How Should Catholics Vote, our presentation and discussion this afternoon on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. My name is Nicole Labadie. I'm the Director of Campus Ministry here at the University of St. Thomas, and joined by some of my colleagues, both in campus ministry and at the Center for Faith and Culture. Before we dive any further into our event for today, I'd like to open us up in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Lord God, as the election approaches, we seek to better understand the issues and concerns that confront Houston, Texas, and our country, and how the gospel compels us to respond as faithful citizens in our community. We ask for the eyes that are free from blindness, so that we might see each other as brothers and sisters, one and equal in dignity, especially those who are victims of abuse and violence, deceit and poverty. We ask for ears that will hear the cries of children unborn and those abandoned, men and women oppressed because of race or creed, religion or gender. We ask for minds and hearts that are open to hearing the voice of leaders who will bring us closer to your kingdom. We pray for discernment so that we may choose leaders who hear your word, live your love, and keep in the ways of your truth as they follow in the steps of Jesus and his apostles and guide us to your kingdom of justice and peace. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and through the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So we wanted to offer this program to you all at the University of St. Thomas community because we know that there's no perfect political candidate, right? There's no candidate or party that fully upholds all of the church's moral teaching. And so we wanted to really dive into a really wonderful document on forming your conscience, how to go about approaching who to vote for, what should inform your decisions in terms of candidates, bills that are up for being passed, anything that you'll find in the voting booth. The church gives us instructions on how to properly form our conscience. And so a little bit about how our event is structured. For the first 45 minutes, we'll hear a presentation from Dr. Squires, whom I'll introduce in a moment. And following that, we'll have about half an hour for just Q&A. So as we listen to the presentation, feel free to type a question or two into the chat. Max Linville, our campus minister, will be our moderator. He and Bridget Richardson from the CFC will be sort of fielding questions, and then we'll give those to both myself and Dr. Squires during the Q&A portion. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Squires. Dr. Stuart Squires is an Associate Professor of Theology and Associate Director of the Center for Faith and Culture. He earned his PhD from the Catholic University of America, his MA from the University of Chicago, and his BA from DePaul University. He also served in the Peace Corps in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. His area of research interest is the early church fathers, specifically Augustine of Hippo. He has published a book with Whip and Stock titled The Pelagian Controversy, An Introduction to the Enemies of Grace and the Conspiracy of Lost Souls. And with that, we will show his presentation for you all.
Good afternoon and welcome to How Should Catholics Vote? My name is Dr. Stuart Squires. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Faith and Culture and Associate Professor here at the University of St. Thomas. As we come to the end of this seemingly endless 2020 election cycle, we'd like to pause before we head into the voting booths and to reflect on this question of how should Catholics vote? What are the guiding principles? What are the guiding questions that Catholics should think about before we head into the voting booth, and then while we're in there as we pull the lever? There's a couple of things I'd just like to talk about and tell you what we're going to do today. So first of all, I'm not here to tell you which candidate to vote for. I'm not here to tell you which political party to vote for. What I would like to do is to go through some select quotations from a document called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship that was written by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So again, we're talking about how should Catholics vote, not for whom, not which particular individual or particular party. And I'm not here to give you my opinion. This is not my own personal musings. This document, again, written by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So if you don't know what that is, that's kind of what it sounds like. It's the group of U.S. bishops here in the United States. They come together yearly and for a variety of reasons, establish policies. But one of the things that they do is they write and publish texts. So the main point here is that this text is not just, again, my opinion or the opinion of a random group of people who got together, but because it was written by the U.S. bishops, it has a gravity, it has a weight to it, it has an authority to it that we need to take very, very seriously. Now, I've, again, selected out just a few of the choice selections from the text. My first and probably most important comment to make is that I recommend that you read the entire document. You can find this document for free online. Again, it's called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. It's been written, it was written quite a while ago, but it's been updated several times, most recently in the fall of 2019, before that in 2015. So again, the document is slightly updated every few years. Also, last sort of point of preface, I wore a purple tie today, not a red tie or a blue tie, just so I wasn't seeming to send any sort of subliminal messages about which candidate to vote for. My role here today, again, not to give you my opinion, but to work through some of these selections, these quotations for you, explain some of the technical theological vocabulary, maybe put it into context, and just sort of draw out or unpack some of the meaning of each of these selections. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today and what we're not going to do. If you would go to the next slide for me. Thank you very much. So the first thing we see that the document tell us is vote your conscience. So let's just read through, again, this is a word-for-word quotation from the document itself. The church equips its members to address political and social questions by helping them to develop a well-formed conscience. Catholics have a serious and lifelong obligation to form their consciences in accord with human reason and the teaching of the Church. Conscience is not something that allows us to justify doing whatever we want, nor is it a mere feeling about what we should or should not do. So that's telling us what the conscience is not, and then it goes on to tell us what it is. Rather, conscience is the voice of God resounding in the human heart, revealing the truth to us and calling us to do what is good while shunning what is evil. It always requires serious attempts to make sound moral judgments based on the truths of our faith. And it is a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that he is going to perform, is in the process of performing, or has already completed. And all he says and does, man is obliged to follow faithfully what he knows to be just and right. Okay, a couple of comments to make there. First of all, notice that the bishops are not jumping straight into the question of voting. What are the principles we should think about? It's sort of slowly going to get us to that point, but it first wants to set down some foundational principles. And the first one we see here, again, is vote your conscience. Now, that might seem obvious, and in fact, it might seem so obvious that it may not even need comment, but it is, I think, important, and I'm glad that they started this document in this way, because You may know that in the 1960 presidential election, which of course led to Senator Kennedy becoming elected president, and he's the first and only Catholic to ever be elected to the president, there was at that time, and to a certain extent still to this day, a suspicion about certainly Catholic politicians, but Catholics in general. There was the assumption that if Senator Kennedy were the president, that he would not be beholden to the American people. He would be beholden to the Pope in Rome as a Catholic, that any decision that he makes would ultimately be guided by the Pope. And likewise, a lot of non-Catholics, sometimes to this day, think that Catholics just do whatever their parish priest tells them to do, that the priest preaches on Sunday morning and says, vote for this candidate or vote for that candidate, and that we Catholics just sort of blindly do what we are told to do in the pulpit. And so I think it's important, certainly for Catholics, but also for non-Catholics, to understand right at the very beginning, no, we vote our consciences. We do not blindly obey anyone's directives. So we vote our conscience, but I also think the second point here is it's important that they tell us, well, what is the conscience and what is the conscience not? Because I think in our dominant American culture today, and that's what we in the Center for Faith and Culture are constantly thinking about, how does the culture, our dominant American culture, think similarly or differently to what we Catholics think? Our conscience, as defined by our culture, is, again, just doing whatever we feel like doing, or that our conscience is something that allows us to justify doing whatever we want to do. And we see here that the Catholic definition of conscience is different from that, right? It's the voice of God resounding in the human heart. And we should also think about the conscience here as sort of a muscle, right? It's a muscle, and like any muscle, it needs to be developed. It needs to be formed, right? So yes, vote your conscience, follow your conscience, but before you do that, you have to form your conscience. And that's something, again, that we often don't think about. Our dominant American culture doesn't talk about that. It says follow your conscience, but we rarely hear anyone talking about forming your conscience ahead of time. So that's the next thing. If you'd move on to the next slide for me, please. We need to talk about the formation of the conscience, because consciences can be malformed. And so when we follow our conscience, when it's malformed, that leads to problems. So first we must form the conscience. Let's see what the U.S. bishops have to say for us here. The formation of conscience includes several elements. Number one, first, there is a desire to embrace goodness and truth. So in other words, not to, again, justify doing whatever we want or sort of turn inwards and say, well, my conscience says this, and so I'm going to do it. That's a sort of inward-looking way of thinking about the conscience, where this is saying we have a desire to embrace goodness and truth. And objective truth and goodness and beauty are outside of ourselves, and so we have to turn away, reorder our desires so that we're oriented towards neighbor and towards God. So a desire to embrace goodness and truth, not just to, again, justify doing whatever we want. For Catholics, this begins with a willingness and openness to seek the truth and what is right by studying sacred scripture and the teaching of the church as contained in the catechism of the Catholic Church. So there is sort of an intellectual pursuit, an intellectual investigation, but at the same time, we shouldn't think about forming your conscience as an exercise simply as the intellect, because that would say that people with a lot of degrees have well-formed consciences, and people who are illiterate have malformed consciences, and that's certainly not the case. It certainly is the case that there are people who are illiterate and yet have very well-formed consciences, and there are people with a lot of degrees who oftentimes have malformed consciences. So on the one hand, there is this intellectual component of immersing ourselves in the tradition, while at the same time not reducing this down to an intellectual exercise. It is also important to examine the facts and background information about various choices. Finally, prayerful reflection is essential to discern the will of God. Catholics must also understand that if they fail to form their consciences in the light of the truths of the faith and the moral teachings of the Church, they can make erroneous judgments. In other words, make mistakes, either in life or in the voting booth in particular. So we see here, again, the conscience is like a muscle or a skill. Think of, let's say you want to hit a home run in the World Series. How do you do that? Well, you can't just show up the day of the World Series. If you do that, you'll strike out in 3 pitches, right? You need to exercise, lift weights. You can't eat McDonald's every single day. You need to eat well. You need to swing the baseball bat 1,000 times every day for 20 years. And then when you show up finally in the World Series, not only can you hit a home run, but you can do it effortlessly. And that's the idea of forming the conscience. So that when you, after you form the conscience, and we should say that the Catechism tells us that the formation of the conscience is a lifelong, ongoing process. You never finish forming your conscience. But when you show up in the voting booth to vote, you can do so effortlessly, in a sense. You are able to discern the issues at stake, the candidate's position, and then vote effortlessly. So, yes, vote your conscience, but form your conscience first. Next slide, please. Again, notice here the virtue of prudence. We're still not yet talking about actual voting. The bishops are slowly walking us to the point, which we'll get to in the second half of the presentation, the point about voting. So, virtues are always important in any sort of action like voting. So let's read this section and then we'll talk about it. The virtue of prudence. The church fosters well-formed consciences. Notice that repetition there of insistence on the importance of a well-formed conscience. Not only by teaching moral truth, but also by encouraging its members to develop the virtue of prudence, which St. Ambrose described as the charioteer of the virtues. Prudence enables us to discern our true good in every circumstance, and to choose the right means of achieving it. Again, what is truly good for us, not necessarily what we think will feel good, or because of a malformed conscience choose incorrectly, but to discern our true good. Number 2, prudence shapes and informs our ability to deliberate over available alternatives. Number 3, to determine what is most fitting to a specific context. And number 4, to act decisively. Exercising this virtue often requires the courage to act in defense of moral principles when making decisions about how to build a society of justice and peace. So, let's talk about this a little bit. So first of all, the virtue of prudence is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, along with fortitude, justice, and temperance. Cardinal, strange word there, coming from a Latin word which simply means hinge, like the hinge of a door, right? So you have this big, huge wooden door, and that's what you see, and you don't often pay attention to the hinge on the door. But really, the hinge, in a sense, is the most important thing, because the hinge is what allows the door to stay on the frame and to move in and out. Without the hinge, the door either won't open or it'll just fall off the frame. So it's small, the hinge is small, but it is the thing that allows the door to do what it's supposed to do. Again, this idea of the virtue of prudence, not something we dwell a lot about, thinking about, but it's the thing, along with the formation of the conscience, that will allow us to vote the way that we need to vote. So a virtue, again, is a good habit, right? Not a habit in the sense of I chew on my fingernails mindlessly, but a sort of conscious with intent action that is repeated over and over again to develop this good virtue, this ability to, again, to discern our true good and to form a plan to act decisively. So virtues, like the conscience, must be formed, right? It's not, again, think of that analogy of athletics, that we have to form our virtues just as we do our conscience, because if we don't do that well, then we will not develop virtues, we will develop vices, which are bad habits, right? Habits that are ingrained in us and our character that do not help us discern the true good. Next slide, please. Intrinsically evil acts. So this is now we're starting to get into real technical theological vocabulary that I want to help unpack and define for you. What the document is going to tell us here is that when we go into the voting booth to vote for a particular person, that there are certainly a million different issues that need to be considered, but there's, so to speak, a hierarchy of issues. So think of, taxes are always an important one, defense spending, education, the list of things that we need to consider are endless. But what the bishops here want to tell us is that these issues that deal with intrinsically evil acts need to be at the top of our list when we consider the different platforms of a particular individual. So, intrinsically evil acts. There are some things we must never do as individuals or as a society because they are always incompatible with love of God and neighbor. Such actions are so deeply flawed that they are always opposed to the authentic good of persons. These are called intrinsically evil actions. They must always be rejected and opposed and must never be supported or condoned. And then it gives a list here of intrinsically evil acts: abortion, euthanasia, cloning, destructive research, genocide, torture, targeting non-combatants, racism, treating workers as mere means to an end, subjecting workers to subhuman living conditions, treating the poor as disposable, redefining marriage to deny its essential meaning. So a list of specific intrinsically evil acts. Let's talk about that term there, intrinsically evil. In the moral life, there are we do moral actions every day. Most of the time they're fairly small, but sometimes we deal with big moral questions in our lives. Oftentimes in our moral lives, the actions that we do will be morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy, depending on a variety of circumstances or intent, right? So certain actions are not, in their very nature, evil or good, but it depends on a variety of context. So, for example, if I'm dancing with a woman, and while we're dancing, I step on her foot and I break her toe, the question is, well, is that a morally blameworthy action? And the answer, of course, is, well, it depends on things like my intent, right? Did she and I, were we in a fight earlier in the day and I'm really angry and I've been stewing all day, and here at the end of the day, it sort of just bubbles over and I can't stand it anymore and I want to lash out at her, and so I step down on her toe on purpose and I break her toe. If that's the case, if that's my intention to hurt her, then obviously the answer is yes, that is morally blameworthy. But if that's not the intention, if it's simply I'm a terrible dancer and I am a terrible dancer, and I step on her toe and I break it, she's still going to be in pain one way or the other. So in the immediate moment, she probably doesn't care one way or the other. But it does matter. In that particular instance, is not a morally blameworthy action because I was not intending to hurt her. It just so happens that I accidentally stepped on her toe. Most moral actions, I would say, fall under that sort of category where circumstance, context, intent matter. But, and this is where we get with intrinsically evil acts, there are some actions that it doesn't matter what your intention is. It doesn't matter what the context. The very nature of doing the action means it is evil. Context doesn't matter. Intent doesn't matter. The action itself is evil. By evil, we mean, in the technical theological sense, it's an action which lacks goodness, right? Philosophers and theologians speculate for thousands of years about what this means. Again, in general, we can boil it down to an evil action is an action that is not oriented towards God or neighbor. Think about Jesus when he was asked the most important commandment, to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? This is sort of the heart of the moral life, that good actions, morally praiseworthy actions, are actions which are oriented oriented towards neighbor and towards God, whereas evil actions, actions which lack goodness, are not oriented towards neighbor or towards God. It's of course a lot more complicated than that, but that's a good basic definition we can work off here. So again, an intrinsically evil act, an act which lacks goodness in the very nature of doing the act, irregardless of context or intention, are actions which are always evil. And I just listed some intrinsically evil acts here. Next slide, please. Now we're finally slowly transitioning here towards what the bishops want to tell us about voting. Making moral choices. Sometimes morally flawed laws already exist. We're talking about civil laws here, laws that are on the books. We're not talking about religious laws. In this situation, the process of framing legislation to protect life is subject to prudential judgment, there's that virtue of prudence again, and the so-called art of the possible. At times, this process may restore justice only partially or gradually. Remember we talked already, I mentioned in passing, justice as one of the other cardinal virtues. Again, this is a complicated issue, but we can boil it down to a definition of justice is giving to the other what is owed or due to that person or a group of people or a society or a country or something, right? So to protect life is subject to prudential judgment and the art of the possible. At times, this process may restore justice only partially or gradually. For example, St. John Paul II taught that when a government official who fully opposes abortion cannot succeed in completely overturning a pro-abortion law, he or she may work to improve protection for unborn human life, limiting the harm done by such a law and lessening its negative impact as much as possible. Such incremental improvements in the law are acceptable as steps towards the full restoration of justice. However, Catholics must never abandon the moral requirement to seek full protection for all human life from the moment of conception until natural death. So now we're getting into the question of what should voters expect of their elected leaders, right? Certainly it would be great if we were to elect new leaders and the day after they are elected, they immediately overturn unjust laws. That would be great, that would be ideal, but of course we live in the sort of real world and the ideal world is not always possible. So this document here talking about the art of the possible. What is possible? And what we should expect of our politicians is that when they are elected, that they work towards overturning any unjust laws and to put us on the right path, so to speak, always reaching for the ideal, and hopefully someday we could certainly get to a fully just set of laws. In a world of original sin, that might probably never be possible. But as long as we are marching on the right path towards truly just laws, then we can accept it when our politicians do not give us exactly immediately everything that we want. It might sound like a sort of obvious statement, but again, we're laying down the foundations, and I do think it's important that we keep this in mind as we think about what should we expect from our politicians when they get voted into office. Our founding fathers certainly established within our governmental system the idea of the necessity of compromise, which is often a dirty word today, but that necessity of compromise was intentionally placed in the founding of our government by our founding fathers. We shouldn't think about compromise as a dirty word. So we can and should compromise on particular pieces of legislation, but we should never, as it says at the end here, abandon the moral requirement to seek full protection. We should never compromise our principles, even while compromising on specific pieces of legislation. Next slide, please. So now we come to what I think is the most important part of the document and the most sort of subtle and nuanced part of the document. So we need to take this slowly and carefully and really understand what it's trying to tell us, because if we rush through it too quickly, we can misunderstand what it's telling us. So, Catholics often face difficult choices about how to vote. This is why it is so important to vote according to a well-formed conscience that perceives the proper relationship among moral goods. Notice there once again this repetition of the idea of a well-formed conscience. The bishops are repeating themselves not because they have nothing left to say, nothing new to say, but because they know that anytime you want to really hit a point home hard, you repeat yourself. So they keep coming back to this idea of a well-formed conscience. A Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who favors a policy promoting an intrinsically evil act, such as, and we saw this list already, abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, deliberately subjecting workers or the poor to subhuman living conditions, redefining marriage in ways that violate its essential meaning or racist behavior, if the voter's intent is to support that position. In such cases, a Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in grave evil. At the same time, a voter should not use a candidate's opposition to an intrinsic evil to justify indifference or inattentiveness to other important moral issues involving human life and dignity. All right, again, we need to make sure we understand this subtle point. So what this is saying is that we as Catholic voters cannot vote for a candidate who favors a policy promoting an intrinsically evil act, as we just defined it, if it is our intent to support that position. So, for example, if candidate A holds to that cloning is good, and we already saw that cloning is an intrinsically evil act, that I as a Catholic voter cannot vote for that person if it is my intent to support that position. Notice again, that important word there is intent. That's the word that we need to be careful that we don't run right past. This gets back to what we were talking about earlier when I gave the example of dancing with a woman. If I step on her foot and I break her toe, and it's my intent to do that because I'm mad at her, then that is a morally blameworthy action. But if I just do it on accident because I'm a bad dancer, then certainly she's in pain, but that's not a morally blameworthy action. Once again, the idea of intent is at the forefront. What is my intention as a Catholic voter? Am I intending to support candidate A's position on cloning? If the answer is yes, then again, the document tells us that we are guilty of formal cooperation in grave evil. However, if I'm voting for candidate A, not for the intention of supporting candidate A's position on cloning, but I'm doing it to support some other position, then it is acceptable to vote for candidate A. And I think this is one of the most important, if not the most important things that separate us as Catholic voters from the dominant American way of thinking in our culture about voting. In our public discourse, in the larger culture today, we never hear anything about intention of voter, right? It's always, do you support this particular candidate's platform? And you never hear anything about intention. What is your intention? Do you intend in voting for candidate A this policy position or that policy position or both of them? What is the intention of the voter? That's the most important distinction here from us as Catholic voters to the larger dominant American culture. Next slide, please. We're still on the same theme or question here about voting for a candidate who does not fully embrace Catholic moral or social teachings, right? And in fact, even Catholic politicians often don't. Very rarely, if ever, will we have two candidates running for for an office, and it is very clear for whom to vote because that person fully embodies the Catholic moral and social teachings. So that's why it gets more complicated. There may be times when a Catholic who rejects a candidate's unacceptable position, for example, cloning, even on policies promoting an intrinsically evil act, may reasonably decide to vote for that candidate for other morally grave reasons. Think about that list of intrinsically evil actions we talked about earlier. Voting in this way would be permissible only for truly grave moral reasons, not to advance narrow interests or partisan preferences or to ignore a fundamental moral evil. All right, what is this telling us? Let's take me as an example. I am an educator. I've spent my entire life either in school or teaching. Last semester, I taught a graduate course on the Catholic philosophy of education. So I am constantly thinking about education. This is my vocation. This is what is at the heart of who I am and what I think about. What this section is telling me is, yes, I can vote for candidate A who supports cloning, and that I as a Catholic voter cannot do that. I can still vote for that person. However, my reason or my intention for voting for candidate A cannot be because that person has, in my opinion, the best education policy. What this is saying is that the reason or intention that I vote for candidate A, despite candidate A's position on cloning, must deal with other morally grave reasons. In other words, moral issues. Now, yes, we can certainly talk about education as a moral issue, and I certainly 100% agree with that. But when this is saying other morally grave reasons, it's referring back to those issues that we talked about earlier that deal with the dignity of the human person because we are created in the image and likeness of God. Euthanasia, abortion, etc. So those other things that we as voters think about, I'd mentioned earlier, taxes, right? How high should our taxes be? Defense spending, a variety of other issues. Again, those are important issues and need to be considered. Education, again, being one of those. But it's those issues that deal with the dignity of the human person, those fundamentally moral questions. Again, education is a moral question, but it's not a fundamentally moral question. So if I vote for candidate A, despite the fact that candidate A believes in cloning, and I'm voting not in my intent to support that, the other reason must be a moral reason, a fundamentally or centrally a moral reason. Next slide, please. What if all candidates support intrinsically evil policies? I mentioned a moment ago, it's very likely that all candidates in any election cycle do not perfectly match with Catholic moral and social teachings. What do we do? What do we do in that case? Well, let's see what the bishops have for us. When all candidates hold a position that promotes an intrinsically evil act, the conscientious voter faces a dilemma. The voter may decide to take the extraordinary step of not voting for any candidate, or, after careful deliberation, may decide to vote for the candidate deemed less likely to advance such a morally flawed position and more likely to pursue other authentic human goods. All right, a couple of points to talk about there. First of all, it says, you may choose, if your well-formed conscience dictates, not to vote at all for for one candidate or another. Now notice it says an extraordinary step. This is not giving us the sort of excuse to be lazy voters, or if it's raining out on the day of the election to say, well, use this as an excuse. I don't really like either of the two candidates, so I'm just not going to vote. Again, that must be an extraordinary step, a rare step, a step that we take with great deliberation. And we also need to keep in mind that this document, again, was written by U.S. bishops. This was not written, for example, by bishops in the Vatican. So the U.S. bishops, they know their history, our history as Americans, how many times throughout our history people have died for the right to vote. We know our history in this, and so the bishops are not taking this lightly. They're not suggesting that we do this unless it's an extraordinary step. Second point in this slide to pay attention to is this idea of voting for a candidate deemed less likely to advance such a morally flawed position. In other words, when we consider two candidates, it's not simply does candidate A hold position like cloning and candidate B not hold that position. It's unfortunately more complicated than that. So let's say, again, candidate A supports cloning, which we saw as an intrinsically evil act. We as voters cannot simply consider whether he or she believes in cloning, but rather how likely is it that candidate A, if elected, is going to advance that position? So, for example, maybe candidate A believes human cloning is a good thing, but never talks about that on the campaign trail. It's not in any of the candidates' commercials. Doesn't talk about it in the debates. It's so far down on the sort of totem pole of initiatives that candidate A has that it's not even that serious of an issue. And we can expect that candidate A is not going to be pushing hard to get a new law in through Congress advocating for cloning. So again, it's not simply a question, does the candidate support or not support an intrinsically evil act? It's on the list of sort of the hierarchy of interests that the candidate has. Does the candidate really want to get a new law passed dealing with this intrinsically evil action or not? That has to play into our thinking as voters when we go into the voting booth. Next slide, please. And this is our last slide. In the end, in making these decisions, it is essential for Catholics to be guided by, there it is once again, a well-formed conscience that recognizes that all issues do not carry the same moral weight, right? I can't just choose to focus on education even though I'm an educator. Some issues have a moral gravity than others, and we've talked about what those issues are. Do not carry the same moral weight, and that the moral obligation to oppose policies promoting intrinsically evil acts has a special claim on our consciences and our actions. These decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments. Again, how serious, how high on the list of priorities is a particular intrinsically evil act for a candidate. A candidate's commitments, his or her character, integrity, and ability to influence a given issue. In the end, this is a decision to be made by each Catholic, guided by a conscience formed by Catholic moral teaching. This entire conversation we've been talking about issues, policy, platforms. I want to note here at the end that the bishops are also bringing in the idea of character and integrity. The primary focus was on policies, platforms, but this is telling us we cannot ignore the question of character and integrity, that also must play into our thinking as we vote. So you can see once again, it's getting even more complicated. Finally, as Catholics, we are not single-issue voters. A candidate's position on a single issue is not sufficient to guarantee a voter's support. That one issue can be any issue. Again, I as an educator might want to say, I only care about education, and I'm going to look at the two candidates on what their positions on education is and vote accordingly, and there I've done my job. Or oftentimes it's a question of abortion. Some Catholics say, well, this is the one issue that matters, and I'm going to look at the two candidates and see what the two candidates think about or promote in terms of abortion, and I'm going to vote on that one issue. Again, the bishops are saying we are not single issue voters. Life is complicated. Politics is complicated, voting is complicated, and we cannot simply look at one issue, no matter what that one issue is, including abortion, and say, that's the one issue I'm going to vote for. We have to take in a variety of issues, moral issues in particular, dealing with the dignity of the human person, and rank them, and at the top are those moral issues, which does include abortion, but again, abortion within the context of those other intrinsically evil actions. We can't just pick one issue. So character is important, integrity is important, and we are not single issue voters. I hope here at the end, on the one hand, this helps to clarify for you. On the other hand, and this may sound like a weird thing to say, I hope it doesn't feel easier to vote. Because again, voting is not easy. The bishops are not trying to make it easy for us. What they're trying to do is clarify, right? Clarifying is not the same thing as making it easy. And so I think the bishops here are offering us a good start, a good document that, again, will help clarify in our minds what we should think about, even if they're not trying to make it easier on us to just walk in and automatically pick one candidate over the other. So I hope that this clarifies for you. Again, my final comment is one of the first comments I made, which is I highly recommend that you read the entire document. What I've given you here today is just some choice selections. You can find the document in its entirety online. It's not that long. You could finish it in an hour or two. Again, it's called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I thank you for your time, and good luck in the voting booth.
Thank you, Dr. Squires, for that thorough presentation of Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, and helping us to understand what the bishops mean when the church talks about that formation of conscience, that's of utmost importance when we approach voting. I also really appreciated your choice in color of tie. I chose neutral colors this afternoon for the same reason. And so at this time, we'll begin our question and answer portion of our time together. I'll hand it over to our campus minister, Max, who's read some of your questions that have come in, and we'll ask them to both Dr. Squires and myself. We also may, for those of y'all who join maybe midway through the presentation, we might reference it and encourage you to go back to watch Dr. Squires' presentation in its entirety. And then, of course, we encourage you to read that document as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. So also, if you have more questions that you want to ask, you're more than welcome to throw them in. So the first question that I have is, shouldn't we allow the church, who is the interpreter of the natural law and moral law, help us inform our conscience and how we vote? By that standard, wouldn't all Catholics have to vote similarly? This would be, of course, given that Catholics have the rightly formed conscience.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Max. I mean, I think on the one hand, it's tempting to think of, it's sort of like an algorithm mathematical formula where you take data and plug it into that formula. Unfortunately, I just think life is a little too complicated for that. So the first half of that question, we did talk about that explicitly in the presentation. When we were talking about the formation of the conscience, the bishops said specifically, part of what that means is to read the scripture and the catechism and the tradition of the church. So to the first part of the question, yes, we should definitely have at the forefront of the formation of our conscience the Catholic social tradition, right? And we shouldn't allow, Hollywood movies or Hollywood culture to to be the things that form who we are, especially as young people. As for the second part of the question, I mean, that sounds good, but I just think life is too messy for that. And I think this gets to one of my last points is the bishops are trying to clarify for us principles, guidelines, but life is too complicated. Candidates are too complicated. I may just take one example. What happens in pretty much every election is you have in the primaries, Democrats sort of reaching towards the edge of their party and Republicans doing the same thing. And then once the primary is over, the general happens, the general election happens, and both candidates often go towards the center, right? So it's not easy enough to just take the information from these candidates and plug it into a mathematical formula to decide this is what the candidate believes, and so therefore this is how I'm going to vote. We have to use our consciences to say, well, the candidate said X, Y, and Z in the primary season, but now it's the general season, and they're saying A, B, and C. This is where I have to use my conscience to figure out, well, what does this person really believe, and how is this person going to act once he or she is in office? Nicole, what do you think?
Yeah, no, adding on to what you said, I agree. It's definitely messy. And I think the fact that there is no perfect candidate or a party that upholds all that the church teaches necessarily means that Catholics in the voting booth are going to vote differently. And the sort of hard truth of the church is that, Dr. Squires can have a really well-formed conscience and I can have a fully well-formed conscience, and we can vote for different candidates and we can still be acting in accord with our conscience. There is that distinction, like Dr. Squires mentioned, of course, like there is objective truth that the church teaches, but because that doesn't get translated into nice and neat candidates or platforms, it is possible for different Catholics to vote in different ways, and for them to be acting in accordance with their conscience. Great question.
Awesome, thank you all. So the next question that I want to ask, so is it morally permissible to be a straight ticket voter? What is our duty in researching every individual candidate on a ballot?
Nicole, you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I will. I don't think that being a straight ticket voter is a well-informed vote at all, because there's the aspects of character and integrity, looking at the individual people on a ballot, what they've done, what their various platforms are. And again, I think it requires a little bit more discernment. Being a straight ticket voter seems to be like taking the easy way out. And like Dr. Squires mentioned at the end of his presentation, it does require hard work. It does require sifting through the various platforms, the various positions. And so I encourage and what they're advocating for.
Yeah, I agree. I think political parties, they usually have, the individuals in the parties have enough overlapping interests where they can come together in a coalition. But parties have differing views, right? Just take the Republican Party. You've got social issue voters. So again, they may overlap on certain things, but they also might actually, we don't think about this enough or talk about this enough, how even people within parties will offer contradictory visions. So just going down the ticket and voting straight ticket, you are probably going to be voting for people who actually often contradict each other. So I think it needs to be, do the hard work and look at each individual candidate.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so this one's been coming up a few times, and I think it goes back to the end of your video where you're talking about we can't be single issue voters. And so some of the questions have come in, can't Catholics be single issue voters in context of intrinsically evil actions such as abortion, euthanasia, gay marriage, etc., especially if a candidate supports one or even multiple of these positions? And then another question is kind of using that same context, but so I'll read this one too. I think the USCCB does support the idea of single issue voter Catholic when the issue is grave enough. As a Catholic, we are not single issue voters, yet if a candidate position a single issue promotes an intrinsically evil act, such as legal abortion, redefining marriage in a way that denies the essential meaning, or racist behavior, a voter may legitimately disqualify a candidate from receiving support. So they're basically asking, like, how do we discern that question again, I guess, like a little bit more in the context of.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of what the second half of the presentation was all about. I don't want to repeat everything that I said. But, again, we do see, as I said, there's a hierarchy of important issues. So yes, the issues that deal with intrinsically evil actions, the ones that deal directly or primarily with the dignity of the human person must be at the top. But at the same time, we saw how long of a list that list of intrinsically evil actions are. And so often you will find candidates who will, yes, they will agree with Catholic Church, and let's say half of the intrinsically evil actions are wrong, but then the other half they may not. So again, you can't just say this person believes or doesn't believe in an intrinsically evil action and vote that way. You have to do the hard work. I think to get to Nicole's point, I think we're trying to take the easy way out, just vote ticket or submit single issue. But like anything else in life, voting is hard, and we need to do the hard work. Nicole?
Yeah. And I mean, just sort of adding on to that, I think there's a difference in, okay, maybe for you individually, that person that asked that question, maybe that does really shape who you vote for, and it should shape everyone's in particular. But I mean, if that's such a central issue to you, I think like you have a duty to respond to that pull in your conscience. But what that doesn't mean is that all Catholics need to approach voting in the same way.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question, we briefly heard about the extraordinary decision of not voting. What would make abstaining from voting acceptable as a Catholic?
Nicole?
So there's the line, and I'll see if I can pull it up real fast. But that if you cannot in good conscience support either candidate, that they both support intrinsically evil acts, and you really truly can't decide, it is okay as a Catholic to not vote. I also want to bring up the other option that we don't usually hear a lot in the public discourse, of voting for third party. It is possible as a Catholic to take the long view in terms of election cycles. We don't just operate on a two-party system, even though like at this point in history that those are the most prominent. It's okay, and it's not considered throwing away your vote, even though others sort of in the media would tell you that to vote third party. There is that option as well. If there is a candidate that might be able to work for more moral and social good in that way as well. Again, I think it really comes down to listening to your conscience and letting prayer also be a part of that gathering data and of that discerning between different candidates.
I agree with the idea of the possibility of voting for a third candidate, but I think that more importantly, we should talk about the sort of impulse that's underneath that, right? The impulse that's underneath the idea of voting for a candidate is that the two main parties don't, the candidates of the two parties don't stand fully enough in the Catholic moral and social teachings, and so we don't want to vote, or we feel the need that we have to vote for a third candidate. I think another, and I would say more important response to that impulse would be, we as Christians should stand up and tell these parties, look, we're not going to financially support you. We're not going to donate to you. We're not going to support your candidates until you give us candidates that reflect who we are and what we want. And, historically, you're right that parties are not intrinsic to American politics. George Washington and others didn't want political parties. Historically, though, we've seen that third parties have not done necessarily all that well, but we have seen historically that parties do shift, right? The party of Bill Clinton is not the party of FDR. The party of Donald Trump is not the party of Ronald Reagan. So parties do shift, right? We used to talk about the solid South at the beginning of the 20th century. That was solidly Democratic, right? All of the South voted Democrat. Now here we are after the middle of the 20th century. That has flipped because the parties flipped. So yes, we can certainly think about voting third party, but I think we need to pay attention to the impulse underneath it and say, look, deal with the realities of the history of the dominance of two major parties and say, we are not going to support you, parties, unless you give us candidates that reflect what we want. And, you know, if enough of us do that, they'll listen and the parties can shift. And then we might actually have some candidates that are close to or fully are representative of Catholic social and moral teaching.
Definitely. And I'll, this goes a little bit beyond the scope of your question, but I think it's also important to remember that we're called to faithful citizenship, even outside of the years, especially outside of the years of presidential election cycles as well. So exercise that that right to vote and right to connect and communicate with your representatives, and to share your voice on these different issues and on ones that the church in particular sheds light on.
All right, thank you. So another question I have, in what ways would you recommend that we begin forming our conscience in this political climate right now?
Nicole?
That's a great question. So one, thanks for coming today. This is a great first step. Two, I'd recommend really sitting with that document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. There's a lot to chew on, there's a lot to reflect on, and there's a lot to read through and to sort of soak in. I would also say start researching what's on the ballot now if you haven't already, because you can't really sift through all of the different candidates and options in a ballot the night before, say. I also really challenge you to pray. So part of forming conscience, as Dr. Squires said, is living the moral life. So continue to seek out the sacraments, go to the sacrament of confession. Choose in your day-to-day life, your ordinary day-to-day life, to love God and to love others well, to act in accord with your conscience, to ask for forgiveness when you sin, and to really pray. Pray for the wisdom and guidance to discern properly and to vote in accordance with your conscience.
I'll agree with all that. I would say, though, that the forming of the conscience, whether voting or just in general, is not something that can be done in 6 weeks. That this is a lifelong thing, and so we need to start earlier. And getting back to my image of hitting a baseball, right? You can't learn to do that in 6 weeks. It takes a lifetime. And one of these. This leads to this idea of taking a lifetime to form your conscience, is that, and you're always doing it, you never complete the formation of the conscience or the virtues, means that, that should usher in a level of humility, which I think we can all agree that we don't see much humility in our political discourse today, right? So when we go into that voting booth, rather coming in with a triumphalist attitude, we need to pull that lever with some humility and continually ask ourselves, have we formed our conscience, or have I just started doing it in the past 6 weeks? That's a question that we should always be uncomfortable answering, and that discomfort should lead to humility, which again, we don't see much of in our political discourse.
Awesome. So the next question that I have, what is the most important issue in the coming election? And what is the most evil of the intrinsically evil actions? Like, could you explain that a little bit more?
Nicole?
I was gonna ask for you to go first on that one. So I mean, there's not just one issue that's at that's at the forefront. Obviously, the document makes it clear that we need to pay attention to those intrinsically evil acts. But I don't think that there's a nice, neat ranking of this one comes first and this one comes second. Each of those issues disregards the dignity and worth of the human person, the dignity of human life. And there's no set ranking in terms of what is more intrinsically evil than the other. They all are intrinsically evil. They just are. And so again, it comes down to us as voters, of really discerning, to have that discerning eye. I don't think there's one single one.
Yeah, I'll agree. And in discerning what the most important issues are right now in this campaign, I think we need to really ask that question seriously, because what are the serious, most important questions to us or to the campaign itself, as opposed to what the media wants to tell us it is, right? The media wants to focus on what are the issues that attracts most viewers so that they can sell advertising dollars, right? And so they're going to lean towards the sensational, whereas maybe there are other issues that are more important either to the candidates or to our country, but it's not as sensational. So again, that means we got to do the hard work of just not doing what the media tells us is important.
Thank you. Here's a good question. As someone who has barely researched anything about candidates and parties, I'm at a loss of what is a great resource of truthfully showing what each platform supports. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, both parties, Democratic National Committee and Republican National Committee, every year, every election, they put out a platform. Except this year, actually, the Republican committee decided not to do a new platform, and they simply said, we're going to go with the exact same platform they had in 2016. I'm unclear as to why they did that or the wisdom of that, but irregardless. So I think a good place to start, though certainly not the only place to start, would be going to the websites, Democratic National Committee, Republican National Committee, and on their websites they have their, and sometimes the platforms are hundreds of pages long and may not be the most exciting things to read. But I think that's a good place to start, especially when we're not just talking about the presidential campaign, we're talking about all the campaigns, and it will sort of cut through at least what the media wants us to focus on. But again, we need to, take our liberal arts education, and as we read these texts, we need to read them with a critical eye. So not just accept everything that they say as gospel. So that's I would say the place to start, but certainly not the place to end. Nicole, what recommendation would you have?
Yeah, another resource that I've used in the past that I found helpful for especially that initial learning is the League of Women Voters sort of puts out a summary, nonpartisan voters guide where basically they just sort of summarize what a candidate's major platform is, what's going to be on your particular ballot. It is nonpartisan, which is helpful. But then from there, you can go and do your own research on, okay, what does this mean exactly? Because obviously that doesn't speak to things like character and integrity, other aspects that are, of course, important and bring to the voting booth. The other thing that I'll say on this topic too is sort of something to just sort of be wary of is a voting guide claiming to be Catholic that tells you which candidate to vote for and which not to vote for. That's actually in accordance with church teaching, because the issue of that document itself is updated every 4 years to reflect the dominant issues that the candidates are talking about. So the bishops themselves will point you to, okay, these are some of the big ones, and they're not, again, it's not a list of like one or two. There's a lot of different issues to pay attention to, but that document itself is revised to reflect the more dominant issues in the
Yeah, and
conversation.
I'll give 2 examples of that, Nicole. In the 2015 version, 2 things were added to that list of intrinsically evil acts that weren't there. And I think this so the first issue was not, I forgot the exact wording, but not treating workers as means to an end. And I think that it was clearly coming out of Pope Francis's pontificate. The second one, remember this is 2015, earlier in that year, the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges allowed federally homosexual marriage. And so was added to the document in 2015. Again, I forgot the exact phrase, but I think it's something like redefining marriage as an intrinsically evil. So those 2 were added in 2015 specifically for what's going on today.
Thank you all. So another question I have is, how do I share this teaching with friends who always see one issue as the priority?
Yes. Well, one, we'll make this this event recording available on the UST YouTube page, so you can encourage them to watch it. There is a campaign as well that I think is a good starting point for conversation. I was going to mention it at the end, and I'll probably direct y'all's attention to it then as well. But it's called Civilize It campaign, and it's basically a pledge to pledge civility, compassion, and clarity in conversations with one another. It's very easy in conversations about politics and voting for things to get heated and for things to turn into a debate. And we sometimes forget that dignity and worth of the human person is also true for the person that we're disagreeing with. And so I challenge you to have those conversations where you can truly dialogue and encounter one another, listen, and you maybe encourage that friend. Why don't you read through the document together? There's a lot to unpack there and a lot of good conversation that can come from it, I think.
I agree, and I'd add 2 other things. We the Center for Faith and Culture, have a podcast. It's called Catholicism and Culture. We're going to put this on our in the next couple of weeks on that podcast. So, if you're driving in your car, whatever you want to listen to it, you can do that. Second thing, to your comment, Nicole, I would recommend before getting into this or reading the document together, sit down and have a meal together, right? And then say, okay, afterwards, we both read this document, in the previous week, and we want to get together and talk about it. But before we get to that, let's sit down and have a meal together. We as that's at the heart of who we are as Catholics, right? The Eucharist is at the center of our spirituality. So why not have a meal at the center of any discussion that could devolve into something really negative and nasty? I think that meal would set the tone of brotherly love, and with working towards the same goal of truly answering these questions rather than hitting each over the head with the questions. So minor point maybe, but I think it could really set the tone for a good conversation.
Awesome, thank you. So here's a question that I think kind of you see at parishes sometimes, is that the priest, how do you discern when a priest sometimes will go up and say, hey, this is who you need to be voting for, really is directing the congregation? How do you consciously in our today's world discern that?
Yeah, that's a complicated one. When we talk about individuals or even groups, right? The College of Bishops coming together. When people speak, they speak with different levels of authority, even within themselves. Take Pope Francis, or for example, actually it started back with Pope Benedict XVI. He started a Twitter feed, right? What the Pope says in his Twitter feed is a different level of authority than when he writes an encyclical, right? So even within a person, the individuals speak with different levels of authority. Second thing we need to consider is when a bishop is speaking, is that bishop speaking on his own, or is he doing so in the College of Bishops, most importantly in an ecumenical council, and then even here with a document like the U.S. Bishops document. Again, those have a greater weight of authority. Now, if we're just talking about an individual priest or an individual bishop, are they saying something from the from well thought out document that maybe they spent time writing and put it in the parish bulletin, or did they just in the heat of a moment tweet something out in a firestorm? And we certainly don't have to. And when we look at history, we don't need to or shouldn't listen to individual priests and bishops, right? Go back to the 4th century. You've got Arius of Alexandria, a presbyter in Egypt, who, based on his comments about the relationship between the Father and the Son, started one of the biggest controversies in the history of the church called the Arian controversy, which led to the first ecumenical council, the Council of Nicaea in 325. Or look in the 5th century with the Bishop Nestorius in Constantinople, one of the most important churches in the entire ancient world, said comments about Mary as the mother of Christ, the Christotokos, or the bearer of Christ, rather than Theotokos, the mother or the bearer of God. And this gets him into trouble, which leads to the 3rd ecumenical council, the Council of Ephesus of 431. So we can look up and down the history of the church where individual priests or bishops have said things either in poor judgment or heretically. And we should dismiss Nestorius. We should dismiss Arius. And maybe there are some clerics today that we should dismiss what they're saying. But again, we need to consider, how are they speaking? What platform, what avenue are they speaking? What is their authority to speak in what given situation? And we need to take all those things into consideration. Nicole?
Yeah, well said.
Another question that I have is, so I think some could say like the reason the USCCB, the bishops don't say anything is because like tax exemptions and all these things. Is there what are y'all's thoughts on that issue of like, oh no, they don't actually hold a platform, they just it's not because of the tax write-offs and everything like that? I guess, how would you answer, or what are your thoughts on that?
Could you reword your question, Max?
Yeah, so the question is, so what is the rationale behind the USCCB not backing a certain candidate, basically?
Well, you're certainly right, the tax exemption part, right? So the tax, if a priest or, a bishop were to formally endorse a particular candidate, that would change the tax status. And that's not just for the church, that's for any nonprofit, right? I think churches are legally registered as nonprofits. And so, I used to be a part of a group in the previous city that I lived in. It was a nonprofit advocating for life issues. But when the election came around, a lot of the people on the board wanted to stand up and say, vote for this person and don't vote for that person. But because, again, technically it's a secular organization, but it was still a nonprofit. So yes to the tax question, but I don't think that's the only reason, right? In other words, if the tax question weren't on the table, I don't think the Faithful Citizenship document would really be all that different. It would still talk about your conscience. It would still talk about forming your conscience. It would still talk about all intrinsically evil acts, all those things. So if the tax issue weren't on the table, I don't think that the Catholic Church would really have a radically different position and all of a sudden say, vote for this party, straight ticket down the line.
Awesome. And then, so I guess one question is, so it seems that Catholics cannot vote for a candidate who supports grave evil, yet both of them kind of are, like if both candidates are, you kind of explained it more. The thing is, like, you have to look at both because it's not ideal. Like, it gets muddy. I guess, how would you help someone discern that even more, though, to be like, hey, yes, both of them are supporting things that maybe you don't support, but like, how do you pray through that more than just saying like, oh, you just got to figure it out, you know? Do you have any more tips that would be helpful?
I would just repeat what I had said earlier about not only does a candidate hold a position or not hold a position, but how much the candidate is going to advocate for that position. I don't know about you. I actually haven't heard a single thing about cloning, which is kind of why I use that example. As far as I know, it's not on the table at all, really, for either of the presidential candidates. So for me, that was the most neutral one to go with. You know, I don't even honestly know what these candidates believe about cloning, but let's just say hypothetically they both think cloning is a good thing. Again, I haven't heard either one of them say they want to advocate for cloning. So we need to take into consideration not just what they hold as a position, but how likely is it that they're going to attempt to advocate for that position.
Awesome. And I think that's a great way to just kind of like be like, hey, we're wrapping it up here and we're going to move forward. But that was the last question. Thank y'all for answering all those. And I know some of them were a little bit more challenging, but I think all of them were answered really clearly. And I think it gives more direction to this upcoming election.
Alrighty. Thank y'all again so much for coming. Like I mentioned, the bishops are encouraging Catholics to civilize it this election cycle. They're advocating for dignity beyond the debate. And so I encourage you to check this out. Take the pledge yourself to pledge civility, clarity, and compassion in your conversations about the election. To learn more about this, you can go to civilizeit.org. We at UST encourage y'all and challenge y'all to model that love for neighbor through respect and compassion during this election cycle, but also beyond, obviously. Put your faith into action and make room in your heart for those with whom you disagree. And take that pledge again to pledge dignity beyond the debate. Bridget, if you could share the slides again, there's a QR code for y'all to check in using the UST app. There's also a question there by way of evaluation. We want to hear from you. There are still 6 weeks left until the election. What other programming do you want to see on this topic of faithful citizenship? What would be helpful for you in forming your conscience? And if there are other questions that you have that we didn't get a chance to answer today, we encourage you to also utilize that QR code to give us feedback. So again, that's in the UST app. Just scan the QR code on your phone. Yeah, we would appreciate your feedback and hearing from you. Thank you again so much for joining us today.